In this lecture, we're going to talk about installing and upgrading Windows. So last week, we actually did a little bit of installing Windows. We installed Windows 7 on the machines here for us to use in our lab. And now we're going to talk about installing and upgrading. So the big things we're going to take away here is the generic process that we're going to use. Here we're going to talk about XP, Vista, and 7, but the process is very similar for 8 and 10. So you're going to talk about the newer operating systems. The big thing you want to remember for this exam is you're going to need to know things like the minimum requirements. So I'm going to show you guys a chart. You want to learn that, and then the features for each different operating system as well. So the basic overall installation process is you want to verify the system has sufficient resources and free disk space. So let's say Joe brings me a computer and says, hey, I want to install Windows 7 on this. I'm going to look at his computer and figure out, okay, he's got 2 gigabytes of RAM, he's got a 40 gigabyte hard drive, he's got a DVD player, whatever his specifications are. I'm going to see, does that meet what Windows 7 needs? We'll talk about those requirements in a minute. We also want to require drivers for all the devices and peripherals we're going to want to use. So for instance, if you're going to hook up that printer in the back to a Windows 7 machine, is there a driver that will allow it to work with Windows 7? Maybe that printer is so old that it doesn't have a new driver. Or maybe it's so new that it won't support Windows 7, it only supports Windows 10. That can be an issue for you as well. Same thing with any kind of external cards, or internal cards, like a video card you're to put in there, or a modem card, or a network card. Those all have to have drivers that will work for the operating system you're planning on installing. You'll also want to prepare the appropriate startup disk when required to prepare the hard disk and start the installation. So are we going to install this from a USB drive, or are we going to install this from a DVD? If you're doing it on a netbook that doesn't have a DVD player, you might need an external DVD player, or you need to convert this DVD into a thumb drive that you can use. We're going to determine the location of the operating system you're going to install. To figure out, are you going to do this? We're going to replace the entire hard drive with the new operating system, or are you going to dual boot the old system and the new system? We'll talk about that a little bit as well. And then you're going to determine what edition of the operating system you want to install as well. Are we going to install Windows XP Home, or are we going to install Windows 7 Pro, or Windows 7 Enterprise, or Windows 7 Home, or whatever the version is that we want to install? We have to figure that out because each version has different features to it. Not all Windows are created equal. So the 3 that we're going to talk about is Windows 7, Windows Vista, and Windows XP. We're going to focus a lot on Windows 7 because it is the newer one. It's the one that's still in use very heavily today in the business world. And you're going to find it a lot out there. And so basically we have a couple different versions here. You can see here under Windows 7 we have the Starter, we have Home and Home Premium, and we have Professional. Under Vista we have Home Basic and Home Premium, Business, and Ultimate. And under XP we have the Home Edition and the Professional. And again, each one has different features, and we'll talk about those more in the next lesson. We start talking about the features of the different Windows versions. So minimum requirements. This is a chart where a lot of the information is going to be very helpful to you. Okay. Specifically, if you look under the Windows 7 column, you can see the processor, 1 gigahertz of speed, right? We look at XP, we only needed 233 megahertz, so it's 5 times more processing power to run Windows 7 than it was for XP. Under RAM, we only needed 64 megabytes before. Now we need 1 gigabyte for a 32-bit operating system, or 2 gigabytes for a 64-bit operating system. So if you guys remember we talked about thick clients and thin clients, and we say, well, hey, if you're going to use a thick client or a thin client, you might be fine using the 32-bit version of Windows because it only requires 1 gigabyte of RAM instead of 2. So I could put 2 gigabytes in the machine, run the 1 gigabyte for the operating system and 1 gigabyte for my programs. So it'll work a lot better for me than running a 64-bit operating system in that case. But if you wanted to run something like a big CAD/CAM workstation where you're going to be dealing with a lot of audio and video stuff, we're going to use lots of memory. And so we're going to need to have that 64-bit version because that's going to allow us to go over 4 gigabytes of memory. Because remember that 4 gigabyte limit for 32-bit operating systems. For disk space, it's somewhere around 20. Don't worry too much about the 16 versus 20. Just think somewhere around 20 is good enough. And again, looking at XP, it only required 1.5 to 2. Now we're talking about 20, so 10 times bigger. And then again, we need some sort of optical drive to be able to read the disk. The disk comes as a DVD-ROM. So we need a DVD-ROM for that. Under XP, it came as a CD, so a CD or a DVD was fine. But really the big thing we're looking at here under Windows 7 is the RAM requirements and the processor speeds, right? 1 gigahertz is speed, and then we have 1 gig or 2 gig based on RAM. You may get a question like, what is the minimum amount of memory needed to install Windows 7? The answer would be 1 gigabyte, right? Because that's the minimum even though you need 2 for a 64-bit system. The big thing that we really had a huge jump from was actually going from XP to Vista. You can notice the requirements went 4 times higher in the processor, 5 or 6 times higher in the memory, right? It wasn't as big of a leap going from Vista to 7, but going from XP to Vista was a big, big change. It cost a lot of money for a lot of people to upgrade there. So some pre-installation tasks. So again, the first thing we want to do is we want to verify your target can run the version we plan to install. So I'm planning on running Windows 7 64-bit. That means I need at least a 1 gigahertz processor, which most computers nowadays are 2 gigahertz or more, so that's fine. And I need to run, I need at least 2 gigabytes of RAM because it's a 64-bit operating system, right? Choose the boot method. Am I going to install from DVD or USB or another different way? We're going to create the partitions for the installation. We did our installation last week. We created a single partition over the entire hard drive for us to install to. We're going to choose the correct file system. Are we going to use a FAT32 or an NTFS file system? We would usually use NTFS. That's what the default is, because it is more secure and has a lot more features over FAT32, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. We want to understand when and how to load third-party drivers. When we tried to do a RAID, for instance, with our systems on the lab last week, we didn't have the proper driver, so we couldn't install the RAID, so we ended up going back to a single disk configuration because our motherboard didn't support RAIDs with Windows 7. Understanding the differences between workgroups and domain setups. If we're doing this in a small office, home office environment, we're going to use a workgroup setup. If you're going to do a large office environment, you're going to use a domain setup. For instance, here in our school, we use a domain setup where you guys log into the AACC domain. Your computer acts more as a dummy terminal just to get onto our network and get to our resources. Whereas if we're using it in more of a workgroup environment, we have all the software and all of the programs are stored locally. And then you can share things like printers and files if needed in a workgroup environment. And then we're going to do setting up our date, our time, our language, our region settings, and all of those things to make sure that we have it in the proper way, just like we did last week when we went through all of the settings. So how do you get the information about this machine? Let's say somebody drops off this generic white PC on your desk and says, hey, I want to be able to install Windows 7. Well, you know nothing about this PC. You don't know how fast it is. You don't know how much memory there is or anything like that. There's a lot of different tools out there that you can use to find this information out. If it already has an operating system on it, you can just go into the operating system and look at the hard drive size. You can look at how much memory it is. You can look at how much memory it has. In fact, you can actually download and use the Windows Upgrade Advisor, which you can see up here at the top right of my screen, is an example where it goes, hey, I've looked and you only have half a gigabyte of memory, but you need 1 gigabyte of memory. So you need to upgrade that, right? We can use system information, MSInfo32, and we'll play with that when we get into our labs, where it'll actually give you the information about that system. How fast is the processor, how much memory, how much hard drive, all that kind of stuff. There's other products out there that do it as well. One of the ones I really like is called the Ultimate Boot CD. You can download this CD, and you can boot from that CD, and there's about 200 different tools in there that you can use that will actually tell you, it'll do memory tests for you, it'll do hard drive tests for you, processor checks for you, and give you a lot of details about this unknown machine. Now, if you get a machine like the ones we have here at the school, and it's like a brand name like a Dell computer, you could just look up the model number online and find out what kind of processor it has, hard drive it has. But if somebody gives you a generic off-brand, like the ones we use for our lab where we built it ourselves, you're going to have to go into these machines and find out the details of it. So, how can we install it? Well, there's lots of different ways to install. The most common one that you're going to do for a small business environment is you're probably going to do what's called booting from the distribution CD. That's what we did last week when we installed ours, right? I gave you a Windows 7 CD. You put it in the disk drive, you start up a computer, it boot from that CD and installed it that way. The second way you can do it is you can install from the network. You can actually have turn your BIOS and tell it to boot from the network. So it's called a PXE boot, which is pre-execution environment. You can see that here on the screen. And it will actually boot to the network and look for a server that's going to have the image of the operating system and then copy that image over and install from the network. So you don't even need the CD. This is usually done in larger environments. The third way is you can do what's called drive imaging. And that's what we do here at the school for our computers, because again, we have all these classrooms with 20 computers each. It would take us a long time to go and install the operating system on every single computer, right? So instead what we do is we create one master computer that we say, okay, this is the way we want this software. We have it all perfectly It's got all the software we want. It's got the Windows on it. It's got Firefox and Chrome, and it's got Microsoft Office and everything we want. This is the perfect image. And then we essentially make Xerox copies of that drive, doing what's called drive imaging. And we have a tower where we can put the source in the first bay, and we put five blank drives in the other bays, and it copies the first drive to the other 5. And that way I can make 5 computers in about 30 or 40 minutes. The copy's pretty quick. Then I take those drives and put them in the computers, and we're ready to go. So this works well when you're deploying to an enterprise environment where you have hundreds of the same machine. Here, if you go to every classroom on this floor, you're going to see we have the exact same Dell workstation, right? And the reason why is it makes our deployment easier because all the drivers are the same, all the hardware is the same. So I can make one image and pass it to everyone. If I have 15 or 20 different models, this method doesn't work well because all the drivers are going to get messed up, right? Because I have to configure it for each machine. But if you keep it down to 2 or 3 models, you can have 2 or 3 master images and use those around. The fourth way you can do it is what's called the recovery CD, or what's more common nowadays is a disk partition that's used for recovery. And this is usually supplied by your manufacturer. So when you buy a Dell laptop or an Acer laptop, they would give you a DVD or a CD in the package. And if you wanted to sell your machine, for instance, you can actually put that back into the machine. It'll boot from that CD, overwrite your entire hard drive, and make it back to factory condition. So that's one way to install back to the factory condition. You can't do much configuration, but it will just re-image that hard drive for you. And then the last way, which you're going to have to use if you're using a netbook, is you're going to boot from a USB drive. So we take that image and we put the Windows 7 image onto a thumbstick, and then we can boot from that thumbstick and actually do it just like we would from the CD, but instead we're using a thumb drive. The nice thing about doing that is thumb drives tend to go quicker than a DVD, and they're smaller to keep in your pocket as a technician. One of the things I have in my technician's toolkit is I have thumb drives with Windows XP, Windows Vista, Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 10. So if I go to somebody's house and they're like, hey, I need you to install Windows 10, here's my CD, here's my key for it, my product key. I can pop out my USB stick and just boot from that and install. Instead of having to carry a portfolio of CDs with me, as I used to do with the old days, I used to have a portfolio of CDs that I would carry. But these are all different ways you can install, choosing which one works for you. As an A+ technician, the ones you're probably going to see most likely is the top and the bottom, booting from the CD or the USB. And the other one, if you're working in an enterprise environment like a college or a large business, is drive imaging. And like I said, drive imaging is really easy. Essentially, you're going to put the source in the top bay, put these other ones in the copy, hit start, come back 30 or 40 minutes later, take that drive and you're ready to boot from it. It's a brand new PC. There's a couple things you have to do afterwards to make them work properly, but they're not too difficult. And you'll get that in on-the-job training if that's the way you're going to be deploying your assets. It's things like changing the computer name at the SID on it. So types of installations. So that's the way we install them. Now we're going to talk about different types. 2 main types that we do. One is the upgrade and one is a new installation. So for upgrading, we might have something like Windows Vista and we want to upgrade to Windows 7. When we do an upgrade, we just overwrite the system files and all the data you have is going to stay there. So all your personal photos, all your personal videos will stay with us. When we do a clean installation, we are actually going to format the entire hard disk and start it like a blank slate. And so you can do this with an empty hard disk or do the same partition as the current version. You can install it to a new partition that will allow you to do what's called dual booting. Or you can also do a repair of the installation. So if I already have a previous installation, but it's causing problems, I can go and repair that using the installation media. On an enterprise level, when we talk about big environments, we like to do things like unintended installations, remote network installations, or image deployments like I was just talked about previously. We'll talk more about those as we go further in this lesson. So as we install from the CD or the DVD, for instance, up here is the DVD for Windows 7 Professional, down here is the one for Windows Vista. You basically set your system in the BIOS to boot from your optical drive, your DVD or CD. You restart the computer with the disk in the drive, and when you're prompted, you're going to press any key. At that point, your hard disk is going to be detected. You're going to create a partition to install to using the disk utilities in there, and you'll accept the end user agreement. At that point, you're going to answer questions in the graphical wizard, such as what your username is, what your computer name is going to be, are you on the East Coast or the West Coast, what city you live in, what time zone you live in, that kind of stuff. And it'll follow you through the steps. For Windows 7, it takes about 10 to 15 minutes to run through the entire installation. It's not a very long process. Beginning with Windows XP, it was longer because you were running it off a CD. It took about 40 minutes. As you go through the graphical setup, you'll be asked certain questions like your name and organization. Here's just a list of some of them. The language, the time and currency the computer should use. Are you going to use a keyboard? What kind of keyboard are you using? Are you using an American keyboard or a Japanese keyboard? What your product key and activation is. So every CD you have is going to come with what's called the product key. It's that 25-digit letters and numbers code that you get from Microsoft to prove that you paid for that license. If it's not in the CD, if you bought a computer from a manufacturer already, it's often a sticker on top of your tower. So if you look at your feed on the Dell computers, on the back side of them, they have a sticker from Microsoft that has the 25-digit code for Windows 8 on there. For that particular machine's license, selecting an upgrading custom installation and the drive location that you're going to install to, which hard drive you're going to do. The second part of it, after it reboots, is going to get to the second part. So copy all those files to the hard drive, and it's going to reboot. And when it does, it's going to ask you other information, such as what username and password you want, what computer name and background you want, configuring your Windows updates. It's generally recommended that you use the recommended settings or install important updates. Don't do the ask me later. Again, you want to be able to use the recommended settings because that's going to get you all the updates, the Windows Defender, updated drivers, phishing filters for Internet Explorer, all the things that protect your computer. You also want to set your time zone, your date, and your time, and setting your location. Are you at a work computer, a public computer, or a home computer for your network? Those are all things you'll set up in your graphical guide as well. The second way we can install things, we said, was installing from our network. And to do this, you're going to have a distribution server, which will either be a Windows 2003 or 2008 Windows deployment service, or in the older days, we called it remote installation service on Windows 2000 to 2003. It's very effective when you have a site license. So if you have one key that works for all the computers, because that's how you license it with Microsoft, this is very effective. If you have different keys for every computer, you're better off doing the individual installation that we just talked about. The nice thing about using this is you can do what's called an unattended installation. What that means is you as a technician don't have to sit there at the computer for the entire 20 or 30 minutes while it installs. Instead, you boot up the computer, you tell it to start, you go to the next computer. By the time you get through all 20 in here, the first one's probably done, you can go back and finish up the installation, right? So it's unattended. All those questions and answers we just did through the guided setup, you'd have them all in a single file. If it's on Windows 7 or Windows Vista, it's unattend.xml is the file name. And it will actually get the answers such as where's the computer name, what are the default user accounts we want to create, what is the time zone of the location, all that stuff is kept in this file. And that allows you to quickly and easily install 20 or 30 or 40 machines instead of having to go to each one individually. Right? So it saves you a lot of time. If they're using an old XP, actually it was called unattend.txt, but again, you're going to see unattend.xml in all the newer systems. But again, it boots over the network, downloads the image, and installs Windows. And you can see that here for the network installation. Here it's installing Windows 32-bit operating system, for example. The next way is the disk image. Like I talked about, it was cloning, also known as drive copy or cloning. Essentially, you're going to copy everything off one hard drive onto the other hard drives. It allows multiple hard drives to be installed simultaneously. Your hardware has to support the same motherboard and the host drive adapter. So again, this works really well if you have a lot of the same machine. All 20 machines in here are all Dells. They're all the same model Dell. It works really well for this. To be legal though, you have to keep this in mind. You have to have a site license for the number of PCs you're going to use or have individual licenses for each one on file. If you don't have a license from Microsoft for the operating system, you're breaking the law and it's called piracy. So you have to have a license because Microsoft charges for the Windows operating system, right? So you got to make sure you have that. When you do a disk image like this, the security ID called the SID is the same for all machines. If you're using a domain environment, this can be a problem. So what we use is a utility called sysprep. And what sysprep does is we run the utility before we connect it to the network, and it changes those SIDs to an individualized number for each one. And this also uses an answer file system, so it makes your installation very, very quick and easy. Very good for large enterprise environments. When I ran the network of 15,000 computers, we used disk imaging exclusively. It's how we did all of our stuff because it was very quick and easy. And generally, if we had a person call up and said, hey, my computer's not working, our solution to the problem was send a technician out, take out their hard drive, put in a brand new hard drive with an image on it, boot them up, and they'd be up and running in 3 or 4 minutes. is a lot easier than trying to fix a problem. So if we thought they had a problem, we just replaced the hard drive, and then we'll solve it later, right? Get some backup and running very quickly. So disk images in an enterprise environment, you will see this all the time. It's very heavily used. Recovery CD and DVDs, or coming from a partition of the hard drive. Acer, Dell, and HP all do this. All major manufacturers do at this point. The nice thing about it is it's going to be a replacement for your operating system with all the drivers and system files already ready to go for that model. So as an end user, they don't have to worry about hunting down all the drivers. And to do this, when you boot, you'll get a utility like we see here at the bottom left. You'll click on Recovery Tools. It'll say, do you want to recover this? And you'll say yes, and it will overwrite the entire hard drive. The nice thing, very easy to restore your system in a case of a catastrophic failure. If your hard drive is just completely dead, you can replace the hard drive, put in the recovery disk, and it will copy all the files over again for you. If you get a nasty virus or piece of malware that you just can't get rid of any other way, if you do this, it will get rid of it. It will get rid of everything on there, all your data and all your malware, right? So make sure you get backups first. It's going to format and replace all the data on the drive. So again, it'll get rid of the bad stuff, but it's also going to get rid of the good stuff, right? And you have to reactivate your license with Microsoft, which isn't a big deal. You hit the activate button, it connects over the internet. It says, hey, you've just reformatted your computer. So again, really good way to do it, especially if you have a customer who really has a nasty, nasty problem with viruses and malware. This can help solve it, okay? But make sure you back up their data first, because otherwise you're going to lose all their photos and they're going to be really mad at you. So when we talk about file systems, Windows supports a couple of different file systems. The most common one and the one that was developed by Microsoft is called NTFS. NTFS is the New Technology File System, and it's so new it was developed in 1995. So for the old Windows NT file system, for the old Windows NT operating system, which was the professional business-based operating system. So it's not the newest thing out there anymore, but it is still called the New Technology File System, or NTFS. The nice thing about it, the reason why they developed it was they were using FAT at the time, and FAT had a 32 gigabyte limit for partitions. NTFS can support terabytes of size. So you can have a single, 1 or 2 terabyte drive all format NTFS with no issues. The nice thing about NTFS as well is it uses encryption and compression. It uses a thing called the Encrypting File System, EFS. We'll talk about that a little bit more later as well. It also allows you to define user permissions with very great precision. So with an NTFS, I can actually say, Sarah can read this file, Nicholas can read and write this file, Joe can only write this file, right? With NTFS, with FAT32, I didn't have that ability. It was either all users can do this or no users can do this. With NTFS, I can really nitpick down to what I want you to be able to do. So it gives you a lot more security. And so NTFS is the one you want to use in your installations, okay? The older installations, you'll see FAT32 was used. Again, it had a 32 gigabyte limit, limited security. All users can read, all users can write, or all users can't do, or can do both. If you have an older FAT32 drive, it can be converted to NTFS by using this command called convert. And you can actually convert things over very quickly and very easily using this. You open up a command line, you use the proper syntax with the convert command, and in about 2 minutes, your drive is now NTFS without any data loss. Okay? You can't go the other way around. You can't go from NTFS back to FAT, but you can go from FAT to NTFS. FAT16, you'll find this on legacy systems. It's an older version of FAT. And then you'll also find FAT64 is a modern version of FAT32 that allows for larger partition limits. FAT stands for File Allocation Table. That's where it comes from. If you have a thumb drive and you buy it from the store, it's already pre-formatted for FAT. Why do you think they format for FAT instead of NTFS? So it can be used on any operating system. Because Macintosh computers don't know how to deal with NTFS. They can read it, but they can't write it by default. And so if I get a thumb drive that's formatted NTFS, and I plug it into my Macintosh, I can read from it, but I can't write files to it. So then I'd have to reformat it, and then I'd have to make it FAT or something else. So if you want cross-platform, you usually want to use FAT32. That's why we still use it for a lot of things. But if you want to use like your actual operating system, NTFS is much more secure and a much better way to go. So hard drive partitions. So when I get a hard drive, I can actually partition and cut it up in different ways. So as you can see here, I have one physical hard drive here on the left, And I have one primary partition and 6 logical partitions. And then there's also this extended partition containing all those 6 partitions. That's how it looks like theoretically, okay? So the primary partition is the one that will have a single drive letter that can be made bootable. So for most of us on Windows, that's called our C drive. C:/, right? That's where we would put all that. And so you can see here, this disk administration panel, you see the C drive here, that's my primary. I also have a primary H drive, D drive, I have a primary, yes, C and H are both primary partitions. And then D and E are both logical partitions based on this color scheme. And then I have free space at the end of the disk. This is all one big disk that was 4 gigabytes in size, and I split it into 5 different pieces. That's all a partition is splitting something into smaller pieces. Extended partitions, they allow for more logical drives. They can have letters, but they don't have to have letters. And they cannot be made bootable. So I can boot from C or H, but I cannot boot from D or E. Okay. You can see we can make some NTFS and some FAT if we wanted to as well, as we have here. We have NTFS, FAT, and NTFS. So how do you make your hard drive partitions? If you're an XP, you're going to use this awesome text-based interface. Basically, you'll press C to create a partition. It'll ask you what size you want, and you'll tell it how big you want it. Okay. In this case, I have an unpartitioned disk of 40 gigabytes. I would hit C. Maybe I'd make it 20 gigabyte for my system and 20 gigabyte for my data. So I can make 2 partitions that way. If you want to delete a partition, you hit D for delete. Okay. Once you have a partition created, you can hit enter on it, and that's where Windows will install. That's the old XP way. In Vista and 7, we moved to a graphical environment that looks like this. And so instead, we can actually hit the new button, and the new button would actually create us a new partition. Once we have a new partition, we can hit format and then say if it's going to be NTFS or FAT. And again, we can make our size however big we want and apply it using this graphical format. It's pretty much the same thing. The only difference here is that it's in a graphical representation, so it looks a little prettier. And as you can see here, we have all this is on disk 0, which is our first disk. Because in computers, we start counting with 0. So 0, 1, 2, 3. And then our partitions here, we have unallocated space. That's free space that we could use. We have a 9.9 gigabyte primary partition, which is where we'll install the operating system. And then Windows in 7 and Vista always has this 100 megabyte system reserve space at the first partition. So that's pretty typical when you're doing Windows 7 or Windows Vista. So after we do all of our installation, what should we do? So we've gone through the setup, we've done the imaging, whatever we're going to do. We now have a working and functional Windows 7 machine. It boots up to the desktop. And now what do we do? Well, the first thing you want to do is make sure it actually works, okay? Test drive some of the installed programs. Maybe you're going to go to Internet Explorer, make sure you can get on the internet, right? Is the network working? Make sure the Task Manager is working. Make sure WordPad is working, which is the basic word processor that's built in. Go to Paint, which is a basic Paint program. Just make sure that it can load and open and close these programs properly. Before you connect to the network, you want to install your security software. You want to make sure you have antivirus and firewalls. Things like Windows Defender or Windows Security Essentials are a great free resource for you for this. If you had a problem during installation, you have all of these different setup logs that were set up during the time that we were doing it. And so if we need to troubleshoot, why does this thing keep failing at this point in the installation? We can go through these and figure out where it was. If it was a text part of the installation, it'll be in the setup log.txt. If it was in the graphical user part of it, we will look at the setup account action.log. Again, most of the time you're not going to need this, but if you do, you can always go back and refer to this slide of those different file types. Most of the time, if you have an issue during the setup, what you're going to do is reformat, try setting it up again. If it comes back again, that's when you start wanting to dig into it because it's probably a hardware problem or a driver problem. The other thing you want to look at is how do we get the data from one machine to another. So maybe you're not installing the software for somebody, but maybe they went and bought a new computer and like, hey, let's start this new Windows 10 machine. And I have this old Windows 7 machine. How do I get the data from one to the other, right? There's a couple different ways you can do it. The first one is using the Windows Easy Transfer, which is what we use in the newer systems. It will copy stuff from older systems to Windows 7 and even into Windows 8 and 10, still use this Easy Transfer. Essentially, you can buy a cable that I showed you here on the picture here. It plugs into USB ports on both sides, one from each computer, and then you're going to end up clicking it, falling through the wizard and using the Easy Transfer cable, or you can do it over the network, or you can do it through an external hard drive. Three different ways to do it. The second way you can do this is you can use the user state migration tool. And if you're doing this in a domain environment or an enterprise environment, this is probably what you're going to end up using, the user state migration tool. It is a command line tool. It's black and white text-based. It can be used on multiple systems concurrently. So let's say I install all new computers in this room and I want to get all your stuff from the computers down the hall. I can do that using this. As an administrator, I can sit back and remotely do it for you guys. It was previously called the user data migration tool. The new one is called user state migration tool. And the last way we used to do it when we went from XP to XP was the file settings and transfer wizard. Again, that's a really old thing. You're not going to go from XP to XP, right? So you're probably going to use either the easy transfer if you're doing a one machine in a graphical environment to another, or you're going to use the user state migration tool if you're doing multiple machines and it's in a text-based environment. Okay? And again, this will be done over the network. So upgrade it. We talked about the fact that we can upgrade or we can do a clean install. One of the things you do need to know for the exam is what are your upgrade paths? So normally the way Microsoft works is you can only upgrade from the last version to the current version. And so what that means is if you're going from XP, you can go to Vista because that was the next version. If you were Vista, you could go to 7. Well, that holds true when you go from 7 to 8 or 8 to 10. But there was one exception. And that was going from XP to 7. Okay. So you upgrade, when you upgrade, you're going to get new features, better security, and a newer thing. But upgrading, you get a cheaper licensing fee than doing a clean install. If I go to Best Buy and go buy the new Windows 7 full edition, it was $200. But if I got the upgrade because I was already a Vista person, I would only have to pay $99. So it's half the price. So a lot of people like using upgrades. Now, when you upgrade, you actually can retain your data. So if I go from XP to Vista, all my documents and settings and all that kind of stuff would follow with me. If I go from Vista to 7, the same thing. All of that would be retained. There was a special thing done, because you may or may not know this, but Windows Vista was not a big hit in the marketplace. It did not leave a lot of people happy. And so a lot of people refused to move to Vista and they all stayed at XP. And so when 7 came out as a way to get people to upgrade to 7, what Microsoft did was they said, hey, you know what? We understand people didn't really like Vista. So what we did was, if you were an XP guy, you want to upgrade to 7, we want you to upgrade. We'll let you upgrade and we'll give you the upgrade pricing. Okay? If you're Vista, yeah, go ahead. You can upgrade and you'll get the upgrade pricing too. But they made a special exception to allow these XP guys to jump over Vista to 7. Okay? By doing that, it's still going to format your hard drive like a clean install. The only difference is it's going to give you upgrade price. So it's cheaper. Okay? So when you think about it on the test, if you go more than one jump, if you go XP to Vista, you keep your data. You go Vista to 7, you keep your data. If you went XP to 7, you jumped over Vista, it had to erase your hard drive. Okay? So just keep that in mind when you're talking about upgrade formats. You can go from from XP to 7, but you're going to lose all your data. So back it all up, put on 7, and then restore your data. Again, your pre-installation steps is what do? You verify your minimum hardware requirements. You verify your hardware works properly, and then you can go ahead and do that. The big thing, remember, XP can go to Vista, keep your data. Vista can go to 7 and keep your data. If you went XP to 7, you lost your data, but you got the cheaper price. Updating Windows. So, updating Windows. We're going to patch and fix a vulnerability or a coding error of the operating system. So anytime you get one of those Windows updates, it's trying to fix somebody's vulnerability that they found. Okay? New features are added through upgrades. Updates are just simply to fix bugs for errors in the software. So when you upgrade from, say, Vista to 7, you get all sorts of new features, right? But if you update from Vista Source Pack 1 to Vista Source Pack 2, it's just fixing bug issues. What a Source Pack does is it's going to fix a bunch of updates and fixes by bundling them together into one single software update. So for instance, if we have Windows 7 Service Pack 1, that's going to take all of the program errors that they found and that they release in their weekly updates. And they're going to take maybe 50 or 100 of these and put them in one software update for you. So let's say you start installing 7 today, right? You would go and download the latest Service Pack, which is Service Pack 1, and you would install that first. And then you do any minor upgrades after that, updates after that. These will fix your programming bugs, your security flaws, and give you some improvements to your system performance. How do you do this? Basically, you're going to determine what Service Pack update is needed. So if I just install Windows 7, I want to make sure I have at least the latest version, which is Service Pack 1. I go to windows.microsoft.com. I can review the release notes. It'll tell me about the problems that there were. I can download the service pack, and then I can install that service pack. And I always want to do a backup before I do some sort of a big update like that. So here's a sample question. Which one of the following is a minimum RAM requirement needed for Windows 7 to install? Minimum requirement is at 64 megabytes, 256 megabytes, 1 gigabyte, or 2 gigabytes. See that 64-bit or 32-bit. Doesn't tell you if it's 64 or 32. So what's the minimum? 1 gigabyte exactly, right? So yeah, so 64, that's our minimum for XP. 256 is nothing, it's just a throwaway because Vista is 512. 1 gigabyte is for the 32-bit version of Windows 7, which is the minimum. And then 2 gigabyte would be the minimum if it was a 64-bit. But because it didn't specify and you just want Windows 7, the minimum you'd need is 1. And then you'd go buy the 32-bit version, right?